My spiritual director years ago was a wonderful, wise Dominican sister, and we'd been working together for a number of years, so there was a fantastic level of comfort and candour in our relationships, but I wasn't expecting the following statement. One day I was talking to her about relationships, and she leant forward and said very quietly but very clearly, "Stephen Ogden, sex is a mystery." Now, of course, my Dominican sister was no ordinary Dominican sister. She was a feminist theologian, scholar, psychologist, a remarkable person. But I hadn't expected this kind of intimacy. And so we had this remarkable discussion about identity, sexuality and sex and spirituality, and how all those things made up her and they made up me. That they are ingredients of what it means to be a human being. Curiously, though, the refrain in our conversation was, why did we find it so difficult to talk about these things? And I'm not talking about saying cheap or tawdry things, but to talk about sex and sexuality and personal identity, my personal identity, in a way that is respectful and intimate and honest, because these are the things that make us who we are. And if we don't talk about them, if we're not transparent, then either we become depressed and forlorn because we're not being honest, or at the cultural level, there are a whole lot of injustices perpetrated, a whole lot of unhealthy things being fostered. There's something about a refusal, a cultural refusal to acknowledge the ambiguity of the human person. That ambiguity is part of who I am, that you and I are a curious and mysterious mix of these wonderful things. With that in mind, and on this Harmony Day, I want to explore the sexuality of Jesus. And I'm not going to, there are no cheap shots here. This is a genuine exploration. I think on the basis of the text, there are some interesting observations that we can make. The first thing we need to underline, of course, in many ways, in the ancient world, there was only one identity. There was only one sex. It was predominantly what we would describe as a male heterosexual perspective. That was the only category. It was the only box. People and communities were sorted, calibrated and judged on the basis of that one box. But what I find is interesting is that there is ambiguity in the life of Jesus and in biblical texts which demonstrate to me that you can't simply sort these things out. So even if the ancient world did not have a sense of personal identity or the distinction between biological sexes or between gender roles, and even if it tried to sort things out, it couldn't overcome the ambiguity. And what I'm exploring today is, for me, that ambiguity is not a problem. That ambiguity is a source of mystery. It's a source of mystery in relationships. It's a source of mystery when it comes to things like love and connecting with others. It makes us who we are. It makes us interesting. And the couple of areas of ambiguity I would like to focus on is, first of all, in the Hebrew scriptures, the relationship between King David and Jonathan, or between David and Jonathan. Now, by any account, they shared a remarkable intimacy. They had an intimate relationship. And the way that intimacy is described is in profoundly feminine gestures, in feminine language. There doesn't seem to be an embarrassment about this intimacy. The intimacy between David and Jonathan is presented consistently as though it was accepted and celebrated. Now, it's always very difficult to argue from silence, but clearly the writers of those ancient texts weren't backing away from the intimacy that David shared with Jonathan. In other words, the cultural categories or classifications of their own era could not capture the intimacy that David shared with Jonathan. If we move into the Christian scriptures, and in particular the Gospel of John, which I've been exploring in recent months, fabulous gospel, really contemporary in many ways. It's about the here and now, about discovering the new in the here and now. And so as we work our way through that gospel, there are all sorts of discoveries, in particular the discovery of transformation, which I'll talk about in a minute. But if we come to the identity of Jesus, now remember, historically, we know nothing historically about the childhood of Jesus. We know nothing about his adulthood, whether or not he was married. We don't know anything about his sexual identity. We presume that he follows suit with his own era, but when we queer the text, when we queer the nuances, when we look at the gaps, at sometimes the silences of the text, things aren't so neat. And in the Gospel of John, and it's not dissimilar from the relationship between David and Jonathan, there's an intimacy between Jesus and the beloved disciple. Once again, it's presented in the text as a given. The writer of the text seems very comfortable with it. He's stating it as it is. And that intimacy is it's deep, it's rich, it's described in certain places in a feminine way. There's that soft, gentle way of describing intimacy. Now, these reflections on David and Jonathan and Jesus and the beloved disciple, I'm not trying to say, I'm not imposing on a first century world, 21st century understanding of sex, gender, personal identities, multiple identities, and the fluid nature of identity. What I'm raising is that the texts themselves reveal to us that despite the fact that there was only one game in town, the patriarchal game, the ambiguity of life, which is a source of mystery and something to be celebrated, couldn't be put in a box. And if you add to it the kind of counter-revolutionary nature of the relationship with Jesus, it adds another sense of ambiguity. By that, if you look at the way that Jesus relates with women, it's countercultural. The story of Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, or closer to home in the Gospel of John, the story of Jesus and the woman at the well. He interacts with them with a sense of mutuality. Often the most interesting theological discussions in the Christian scriptures occur between Jesus and women. So all I'm saying is that in even the ancient world, it couldn't put ambiguity in a box. And that ambiguity is a source of mystery and wonder. It makes us interesting. It makes us who we are. So if we return now to the 21st century, and this being Harmony Day, what are we celebrating? Well, I think from a Christian perspective, we're recognizing that all of us are equal in the eyes of the divine, that all of us are, in a sense, repositories of the sacred. We are sacred. There's something mysterious about each and every person, regardless of sexuality, of gender, of race and culture. And that part of the attraction of diversity, one of the reasons why we celebrate difference, one of the reasons why we don't try and obliterate or ignore differences, is because of what we see as the wonders of creation and the ambiguity, the kind of uncertainty, the questions, the loose ends about another person, about relationships, about sex itself, are a constant source of wonder and fascination. Now, against that, of course, we've had hundreds of years of attempts to put things in boxes. The logic of binary thinking, male, female, heterosexual, non-heterosexual. And those boxes are not only artificial, but they can kill the spirit. And they have been reasons for, or provocations for, terrible violence and oppression. Two texts that are worth having a look at. There's an Australian scholar, Christopher Forth, who's done a wonderful historical study of manhood and masculinity in the modern era, and looks at how the binaries work themselves out, and the heterosexual fear of the other, the fear of softness, the fear of effeminacy. And the other one is a great text. It's a bit old now. Is Pierre Bourdieu's Masculine Domination, 2001. It came out in the English translation. They are really good texts. Now, of course, there's a plethora of fantastic feminist literature and feminist philosophy, and you really, I don't think at that level, if you're really getting into it, you can't go past the work of Judith Butler. Her early text, Gender Trouble, is fantastic, but it is hard work. But it's worth persevering with, and the way she pursues these issues in essays and writings is just a source of inspiration. So all I'm flagging at this stage is that we're still labouring under the burden of the logic of binary thinking, and it's not just simply, I say, putting in boxes, but it is a source of violence and injustice. On this day, on Harmony Day, we celebrate the fact that many of those boxes are being dismantled. We acknowledge that there is a wonderful diversity in the world, of which ambiguity is part of it. Ambiguity is the mystery of myself and yourself and the relationships that we value. And it's something to celebrate and something to honour. We also celebrate, in this perspective, the presence of the divine presence that rejoices in diversity, that manifests itself through ambiguity and offers us the promise of transformation. So let me just conclude then with a brief reflection on the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is a gospel that is focused on the here and now. It's about the promise of transformation here and now. And in that context, it's very hard to go past the story of the woman at the well. And in the intimacy that Jesus shared with this woman, there was an intimacy, there was a candour. And in many ways, this woman is courageous, and because of her courage, she has quite a fascinating theological discussion with Jesus. And in that discussion, Jesus, in a sense, affirms who she is. He knows the truth of her life, but that's not cause for judgment. In fact, her transparency is cause for celebration. So in this story, Jesus celebrates the difference, the ambiguity of this woman's life. And that engagement, that discussion, becomes a turning point in her life, where her life is transformed, not in the distant future, but here and now. In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer and Sustainer, Amen.